Maria Santos had never sought conflict. She had moved into the small, single-story house at the far end of Rosewood Estates with dreams of raising her children in peace. The home was a humble structure, built with her late husband's hard-earned savings, a testament to their shared struggle, their hopes for a future that had been cruelly stolen by fate. When Miguel passed away in a tragic accident, Maria was left to navigate the world alone, clutching onto their 3 young children, and the only place they had ever called home. Rosewood Estates was not a neighborhood known for kindness, governed by a rigid Homeowners Association. It was a place where rules were enforced with iron fist, and those who didn't conform were swiftly pushed out. At the heart of this oppressive regime was Judith Remington, the HOA president, a woman whose sharp features mirrored the cold precision with which she ruled. To her, Maria was an inconvenience, a blemish on the pristine image of Rosewood Estates. The letters had started arriving 6 months ago. First, it was minor infractions, claims that Maria's lawn wasn't trimmed to regulation height, accusations that her home's paint was an unapproved shade. She complied where she could, pouring what little money she had into appeasing the HOA's relentless demands. But the violations continued, escalating to fines she could never afford. Then came the final notice. Her home was illegally built on HOA land, and she had 30 days to vacate before it would be demolished. Maria knew it was a lie. Miguel had purchased the land legally years before the HOA had expanded its reach. But the HOA wielded power with impunity, and the courts, swayed by expensive lawyers and forged documents, dismissed her pleas. Desperation turned to dread as the deadline loomed. The morning of the demolition arrived with an eerie stillness. Maria stood at her front door, her children clinging to her skirt as the growl of heavy machinery echoed down the street. A convoy of vehicles rolled up, HOA board members stepping out in pristine suits, their expressions unreadable. At the center of it all, Judith stood with her arms folded, a faint smirk playing at her lips. "Rules are rules, Maria," she said, her voice laced with mock sympathy. Maria didn't reply. There were no words to describe the helplessness coursing through her veins. The bulldozer roared to life. The children screamed as their home was torn apart before their eyes. With splintered, furniture shattered, and a lifetime of memories crumbled to dust, Maria could do nothing but hold them close. Shielding their eyes as strangers reduced everything she had left to rubble. When the dust settled, there was nothing but an empty lot where her home had once stood. Judith turned to leave, satisfied. The other board members followed, murmuring among themselves about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Maria did not cry. She did not beg. As the final pieces of her life were carried away in debris trucks, she stood with her children in the wreckage and made a silent vow. The HOA had taken everything from her. But Maria Santos was not finished yet. The shelter was cold and smelled of disinfectant. Its walls were lined with desperate faces, people displaced by hardship, injustice, or simply bad luck. Maria Santos now counted herself among them. Her 3 children slept huddled together on a single cot, their small bodies rising and falling in tandem. Despite the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmurs of other families, Maria sat awake, her mind alight with rage. She had no money, no lawyer, no home, but what she did have, what the HOA hadn't been able to crush, was her resolve. In the weeks following the demolition, Maria began digging. She walked from library to city hall, studied public records, and requested copies of land deeds. She asked questions, careful not to draw too much attention. The deeper she looked, the more inconsistency she found. Her home, according to earlier records, was never on HOA land. That changed only after a new set of documents were filed. Documents that bore suspicious signatures and mismatched dates. That's when she met Peter Caldwell. He found her one afternoon in the public archives room, flipping through zoning maps. A quiet man with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, Peter had once been the HOA's treasurer. He had served alongside Judith Remington until he'd resigned under murky circumstances. Seeing Maria's frustration, he offered help. "I know what they did to you," he said. "They've done it before." Peter told her about how Judith had been altering land boundaries to seize properties, about how she manipulated votes, buried opposition, and pocketed HOA dues through shell companies. His conscience had driven him to speak up. In response, Judith had orchestrated a smear campaign that forced him out of the community entirely. With Peter's guidance, Maria began to build her case. He taught her how to read financial ledgers, how to identify forged paperwork, and how to follow the money. Together, they discovered multiple properties with irregular ownership transfers, homes seized, sold cheaply to LLCs, and flipped for profit. As her knowledge grew, so did her network. Other residents, some fearful, others angry, began to whisper. A widow in Unit 14 had been fined into foreclosure. A disabled veteran on Maple Drive had been forced out over an unapproved fence. Each person Maria spoke to became another spark in the growing fire of resistance. But knowledge alone was enough. They needed proof, and they needed a way to act. Peter suggested a lawsuit, but lawyers were expensive. Still, Maria reached out to legal aid groups, writing letter after letter. Most never replied. Some offered apologies, but no help. Then, a breakthrough. A young attorney named Claire Reese responded. She was new, idealistic, and furious about the injustice Maria described. Claire agreed to take the case pro bono. With her legal expertise, Maria's trove of documents, and Peter's insider knowledge, they began crafting their attack. Fraud, forgery, harassment, illegal seizure of property. The list of charges grew longer with each day. But Maria didn't want this to be a quiet courtroom battle. She wanted the world to know what the HOA had done, not just to her, but to dozens of innocent families. So she reached out to the media. At first, reporters didn't listen, but then she shared her story online. A grainy video of her house being destroyed, pictures of her children watching from the curb, a scanned copy of the altered deed. The post went viral. Comments poured in. Outrage spread. People across the country demanded accountability. Local journalists picked up the story, followed by regional news. Cameras came to Rosewood Estates. The same streets where Maria had once been ignored now echoed with the voices of protest. Underneath the media storm, Maria's coalition grew. She called it the Rosewood Justice Circle, a gathering of homeowners and former residents determined to expose the truth. They met in libraries, cafes, and even a shelter. Maria became their leader, their voice. One night, after a particularly long meeting, Peter pulled her aside. "You've done something incredible, Maria. But Judith won't go down easy. She'll fight back." Maria looked past him, toward the city skyline glowing in the distance. "She destroyed my children's home," she said quietly. "She's going to learn what it feels like to lose everything." Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of protests. Inside, Maria's eyes burned not with sorrow, but with fire. The rebellion had begun. Maria had underestimated just how quickly Judith Remington would strike back. It began with whispers, subtle rumors about Maria's past, suggesting she was unstable, unfit, even dangerous. A former HOA board member anonymously leaked fabricated emails and phone calls to discredit Peter Caldwell, framing him as a disgruntled fraud with a vendetta. Claire Reese's law office was hit with a flood of frivolous complaints, including threats to her bar license. Judith wasn't just fighting a legal battle. She was waging psychological warfare. Maria kept going. The Rosewood Justice Circle began collecting sworn affidavits. Residents who once feared speaking out now stepped forward. Claire filed an official civil suit against the HOA, listing multiple counts of fraud, malicious intent, and abuse of power. But as they gained traction in court, Maria noticed something more insidious brewing behind the scenes. Properties aligned with Maria's coalition were suddenly hit with code violations. Utilities were mysteriously cut. Children were bullied in school, and jobs were lost due to anonymous calls. It became clear Judith had built a machine far larger than anyone expected. Her reach extended into local law enforcement, real estate agencies, even the city council. She had allies, many of them well-paid and willing to protect their interests. But Maria wasn't alone either. A national housing rights organization reached out after seeing the viral video. They offered funding for Maria's legal campaign, assistance with media strategy, and connections with other grassroots movements. Maria's story wasn't just a local scandal. It was becoming a symbol. Judith's grip began to slip. News stations aired interviews with victims of HOA abuse. A whistleblower, a former employee at the county clerk's office, revealed how land records had been manipulated. City inspectors launched a quiet investigation. The judge overseeing Maria's case moved to fast-track it, citing overwhelming evidence of malfeasance. Then came the turning point. A private investigator, hired by the Housing Rights Organization, uncovered the keystone of Judith's empire, a web of fake companies used to launder money and buy foreclosed homes. One of those shell companies had purchased Maria's property within hours of its demolition. The paper trail was undeniable. Maria took a deep breath as she reviewed the documents. Her name, her lot, her demolished home, bought by an LLC traced back to Judith's cousin. They had the evidence. Now they needed the exposure. Claire arranged a press conference. Peter stood beside Maria. So did the widows, the veterans, the displaced families who had all suffered under the HOA's regime. On live television, Maria read a simple statement. My name is Maria Santos. The HOA stole my home. But I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every family they tried to silence. The silence that followed was thunderous. Then the phones began ringing. National news outlets, documentarians, politicians. For the first time in years, Judith Remington was afraid. Judith Remington stared out the window of her corner office at the Rosewood HOA building, a pristine white structure that resembled a courthouse more than a neighborhood office. Her manicured fingers tapped against the glass rhythmically. Below her, the protest signs were multiplying and the voices were getting louder. It was only a matter of time now. What's the damage? She asked, without turning around. Charles Benton, her longtime legal advisor and confidant, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Two more board members just stepped down. The City Ethics Committee issued a subpoena for our financial records. And he paused. Claire Reese filed motion to freeze all HOA accounts. Judith's lip twitched. She thinks she can outmaneuver me? She's gaining support, Judith. Charles said quietly. Even the mayor's office is distancing itself from us. That press conference hit a nerve. Judith turned, her eyes icy. Maria Santos is a nobody, a grieving widow with no formal education and no understanding of the machine she's poking. She's been made a martyr. That's all. This will pass. Charles didn't respond. He knew better. Meanwhile, Maria stood in a borrowed suit outside the courthouse, flanked by Claire and Peter. Her posture was straight, but her stomach churned with nerves. The courthouse steps were filled with press. She'd come far, from a woman evicted and discarded to the face of a growing movement. Still, doubt clawed at her. I'm not ready for this, she whispered. Claire put a hand on her shoulder. You've already survived worse. This is just the next step. Inside, the hearing was brief but monumental. The judge, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes, had reviewed the evidence. Fake companies manipulated deeds and countless testimonies. She ruled in favor of freezing the HOA's financial assets pending further investigation. It was a blow, a public, humiliating one. Judith was not present in court, but the moment the ruling was made public, Maria received an anonymous text message. You don't know what you started. The retaliation came swiftly. That night, the community center where the Justice Circle met was vandalized. Graffiti spread across the walls read, HOA always wins. Windows were shattered and threatening letters were left behind. Claire's car was keyed and her tires slashed. Peter's apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Just drawers left open, photos ripped in half, and a single burned match on the floor. Maria's shelter was put on notice for security reasons, forcing her and her children to relocate yet again. But instead of fear, the attacks lit a deeper fire. The movement grew. More HOA members came forward, former treasurers, staff assistants, even maintenance workers. They spoke of bribery, blackmail, manipulation. A retired accountant anonymously provided tax filings that contradicted Judith's financial statements. Every secret Judith had buried was beginning to surface. But Judith wasn't done. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Only 5 members showed up in person. The rest had either resigned or stopped responding. Judith stood at the podium, her voice echoing across the near-empty chamber. This association was built on order, Discipline. Pride, she said. We are under siege by outsiders, traitors, and anarchists who want to see Rosewood rot. We will not bend. We will not break. But the words rang hollow. Even her loyalists looked tired, nervous. When she left the meeting, Judith found her car surrounded by reporters. Questions bombarded her. Did you personally authorize the demolition of Maria Santos' home? Do you deny laundering funds through shell companies? Why are HOA funds missing from this year's budget? She didn't answer. Behind the scenes, Claire was preparing the next legal strike. A full civil suit naming Judith personally liable for fraud, emotional distress, and property seizure. And now, with whistleblowers and financial records backing them, there was a strong chance of a criminal investigation. Peter warned Maria, she'll burn everything before she lets it fall into someone else's hands. And he was right. Judith's next move was desperate. She filed for bankruptcy on behalf of the HOA. She attempted to dissolve the entire organization, hoping to bury the evidence with it. But Maria's team filed an injunction just in time, freezing the dissolution and requesting a court-appointed receiver to take over the HOA's operations. Then the bombshell dropped. An anonymous source leaked an audio recording to the press. Judith discussing plans to rezone properties to sell them to developers with promises of kickbacks. Her voice was clear, her intent undeniable. It aired on every major news network that night. The headline read, HOA president caught in corruption scandal. Judith Remington vanished the next morning. Her home was empty, her office locked, her phone disconnected. She had disappeared without a trace. Speculation ran wild. Some believed she fled the country. Others thought she was simply hiding in one of her developer allies' properties. No one knew for sure, but Maria didn't care. The court granted a temporary stay on the HOA's authority. The judge ruled that Maria's case would go to trial with full civil and criminal consideration. Meanwhile, a third-party firm was assigned to oversee community management while investigations continued. And for the first time in years, Rosewood Estates exhaled. The Justice Circle gathered that evening in the ruins of the community center. Volunteers had cleaned the vandalism, taped the windows, and brought food. The children played while their parents talked and laughed for the first time in months. Maria sat quietly in the corner, watching her children chase each other under string lights someone had hung from the beams. Peter joined her. You did it, he said. No, she replied. We did. Claire raised a glass of soda and called out to the woman who lost everything and fought until the walls came down. To Maria, applause echoed across the center. Maria stood, a little embarrassed, but proud. I just want to keep my home. I never wanted to fight a war. But sometimes, she continued, the war finds you, and when it does, you don't run. You fight for your home, for your children, for what's right. The group erupted in cheers. But deep down, Maria knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. Judith was still out there, and there was still the matter of reclaiming what had been taken. But for tonight, just tonight, she allowed herself to rest. 6 months later, Rosewood Estates looked like a different place. The air felt lighter, the sidewalks less polished but more alive. Children's chalk drawings decorated the driveways. Gardens bloomed wildly without restriction, and the sound of laughter had returned to community that once cowered beneath order. But beneath that newfound peace stirred the final chapter of a story that had not yet ended. Maria Santos stood outside the newly reconstructed community center. Her name was etched onto a plaque by the entrance, not because she had asked for it, but because the residents insisted. They called it the Santos House. It wasn't just a name. It was a symbol. The trial against Judith Remington had been set for the following week, after months in hiding. She had been discovered in a coastal villa in Mexico under an alias, betrayed by one of her own former developer partners after the federal government began probing into offshore accounts. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but the impact of it shook Rosewood like an earthquake. Judith was flown back to the U.S. under charges of fraud, conspiracy, unlawful demolition, and tax evasion. The HOA's entire inner circle, those who hadn't already jumped ship, were indicted one by one. Even Charles Benton, her longtime legal shield, had turned state's witness for a plea deal. Maria sat in the front row of the courtroom on the first day of the trial. She didn't come for revenge. She came for closure. The courtroom was packed. Reporters crowded the benches. Community members watched with folded arms and hopeful eyes, and the new HOA interim board sat quietly behind Maria, led by Claire and Peter. Judith entered in handcuffs, wearing a gray suit that looked nothing like her once impeccable wardrobe. Her once meticulously styled hair was pulled into a taut knot, her face drawn and pale. Yet even now, her chin remained high. As the charges were read aloud, she stared ahead, emotionless. The prosecution laid out the story with brutal precision. The fraudulent companies, the demolition order that was never legally authorized, the kickbacks, the silencing of whistleblowers, and the targeting of vulnerable residents like Maria. But what shook the room was a video, unearthed from an old security feed, showing Judith personally signing off on Maria's demolition paperwork while making a dismissive remark. She's just a widow. She'll cry. She'll move on. People like her always do. Gasps filled the room. Maria felt her chest tighten. But she didn't look away. The defense scrambled. They tried to argue procedural misunderstandings. They blamed rogue subordinates. But the evidence was overwhelming. When Judith finally took the stand, her voice was hoarse. "I did what I thought was necessary to preserve Rosewood," she said. It was never personal. But even she couldn't deny the signatures, the wire transfers, the threats. Maria was called as a witness. She took a deep breath before standing. The room hushed. She told them about her husband, about their dream to build a life in a safe neighborhood, about losing him in a car crash and raising 3 children alone, about scraping together every penny to build their home, about the day she came home to rubble. "I was nothing to them," she said. "But I wasn't nothing. I was a mother, a worker, a neighbor, and they tried to erase me." She didn't cry. Her voice didn't tremble. But when she stepped down, even the judge looked moved. Judith was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10. The sentence sent a national message. HOA boards were not above the law. And yet, when Judith was led away, she didn't scream or beg. She simply looked at Maria, for the first time in all those months, and nodded as if acknowledging the end of a war. Maria didn't nod back. Some people don't deserve even that much. With Judith gone, the Rosewood HOA was placed under long-term independent oversight. The board was restructured with elected volunteers. Claire was unanimously voted as the new president. Peter took over as finance director. The new bylaws ensured transparency, public meetings, and term limits. More importantly, the community was given back to the people who lived in it. And Maria, she got her land back. Not just her land, but compensation. The court ordered the HOA's insurance provider to cover the cost of rebuilding her home, as well as damages for emotional distress. Her new house stood on the same soil as the last one, but it was stronger, larger, and full of light. Every tile, every beam was a testament to resistance. Months later, Maria stood in her kitchen, looking out over a backyard where her children played. Peter knocked on her door, holding a folder. "You should see this." Inside the folder was a proposal, a nonprofit organization offering legal aid and advocacy for residents across the country who were victims of HOA abuse. They wanted Maria to be their face. "You sure?" she asked. "You're the reason we're all standing," Peter replied. "This doesn't end with Rosewood." Maria closed her eyes, thought of her husband, of Judith, of the wreckage, of the rebirth. Then she smiled. "All right, let's keep building."